Adam Zarth here from the Illawarra Business Chamber. Today we're at R&B Lawyers in Wollongong with the third episode of Business Response, our video series to give Illawarra business people practical advice to survive the current pandemic. Thanks again to our sponsors, Wollongong City Council, and to our production partner, Relativity. Today I'm joined by Sam Troutman, a lawyer who specialises in property and real estate law, to guide us through what is arguably the most complex and ambiguous aspect of business response to the current crisis, commercial tenancies. Sam, thanks for being with us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
So Sam, really difficult trading conditions for businesses across the Illawarra. One of the major fixed costs to business, of course, is rent. What can we do to assist businesses reducing their rent when they're experiencing trouble in the current environment?
The first thing you have to do is talk to your landlord and let them know what's happening with your business. That's essential. The next thing you need to do is find out whether or not you qualify for the mandatory code. If you qualify for the code, there are a number of different principles in the code that will assist you in your negotiations for rent reduction with your landlord. If not, then you will be in a position where you're essentially entering into a commercial negotiation with your landlord for rent reduction.
Okay, so what have I got to do to qualify for the code?
Well, the first thing you need to do is register for JobKeeper, and you need to be successful in applying for JobKeeper. JobKeeper is essentially the foundation for the government's relief package. And the code is tied into it, both in terms of the length of period within which the code will apply, and indeed in the essential qualifying criteria as well. So essentially that is a business that is $50 million or less in revenue a year and has experienced a 30% reduction in their turnover directly as a result of the COVID pandemic.
So if I am eligible for JobKeeper, what are my next steps in terms of accessing the code and what happens then?
The key for rent reduction is proportionality. So to the extent that you've got a reduction in your turnover, you should receive a proportionate reduction in your rent. The rent reduction will take the form of waiver, which is essentially you don't have to pay that rent, and deferral, which is you don't have to pay that rent now, but you will have to pay that rent later. In line with that as well, you might consider seeking an extension of your lease as well to ensure that you have the benefit of the full term and the ability to pay off that rent deferral over an amortised period. So the intention would not be that you have a lump sum to pay at the end. The intention would be that you pay that in portions over the course of your lease or a period of 24 months.
So Sam, give us a real life example of how this might work in practice.
Sure. So the caveat for that is that the legislation enacting the code in New South Wales hasn't been released yet, so we sort of remains to be seen what that's going to look like. But an example would be you're a cafe business, you've been forced to close and you're not able to maintain a viable trade with takeaway. That would mean that you've got a 100% reduction in turnover. You would write to your landlord or speak to your landlord. You've already qualified for JobKeeper. You would expect from your landlord a 100% reduction in rent, because you've had a 100% reduction in your turnover. That reduction would look like 50% waiver at the very least, though that can be negotiated, and then 50% deferral. Waiver meaning that you need to obviously not pay it, deferral meaning that you do need to pay it. And depending on the length of your lease, you might find that you're able to pay that off over a period of more than 24 months. But at the minimum, it'll be a 24-month period to repay that deferral. So
what if I don't qualify for JobKeeper, either because perhaps I'm not an employing business or I'm below that 30% threshold?
Well, unfortunately, the code won't apply to you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your landlord won't be willing to come to the table to assist your business during this time. The government's intention is that the code would apply in spirit, and it is possible that your landlord will be receiving some other relief or benefit, whether it's from the government or from their bank. And in that instance, the expectation would be that they would pass that relief or benefit onto your business.
What's your advice to businesses about what they need to prepare for these sorts of negotiations?
First thing you need to do is ensure you have accurate turnover information demonstrating the hardship that your business has endured. Your landlord's going to need that before they're able to engage with you about the appropriate rent reduction that's available. You want to ensure that you're continuing to honour the terms of your lease. You'll fall outside the code if you don't do that. You want to ensure that any communication you have with your landlord is in writing. Relying on phone calls is not going to help you. And the other thing that you want to ensure is that your landlord's prepared to document the agreement that you reach appropriately, whether that's by varying your lease or preferably by some sort of side deed so that the terms remain confidential between the parties.
What are the key points to know about the code for tenants?
From a tenant perspective, you must maintain your obligations under the lease and ensure that you're honouring the terms, because that keeps you within the code. You should expect that any reduction in outgoings or costs that a landlord is able to receive are passed on to you. You should ensure that your landlord is not drawing on security during that period. You should ensure that your landlord is not increasing your rent during this period. If you have an annual rent increase coming up, that should be frozen. And you should ensure that your landlord is not going to charge any interest or fees on any rent that is deferred or owing as a result of these negotiations.
So if the parties can't agree in this scenario, what happens next?
Yeah, so what happens next is there'd be binding mediation facilitated by the Small Business Commissioner, presumably within the context of the principles in the code. At the moment, to our knowledge, there hasn't been a binding mediation, so watch this space.
So unfortunately, some businesses are going to be right now considering what happens if they need to close up entirely. Can you just walk us through this scenario?
Yes, so the National Code won't assist tenants that aren't honouring the terms of their lease. Essentially, you'd be entering into a negotiation for a surrender of your lease with your landlord, and that would be a commercial negotiation that you'd need to resolve in your own individual case.
So am I likely to face a penalty as part of that?
Well, often landlords will require some sort of payout or payment for the surrender of their lease. It's a matter for negotiation though. Obviously, if you have a lease of 5 years with a significant rent and the landlord is not going to see the benefit of that, they may require a higher payment. However, in saying that, in the circumstances of COVID, it may be that landlords are more willing to engage with tenants.
So Sam, what's the predicament for landlords in this scenario, particularly smaller ones?
Yes, so the New South Wales government has announced some land tax relief, which unfortunately probably won't reach many of the smaller landlords, as quite often they don't have a land tax debt. Outside of that, there are some announcements that have come through from the Australian Banking Association indicating that banks would be willing to defer loan payments for up to 6 months on the basis that interest is capitalised, which essentially means it's repaid or the loan is extended. However, you would need to demonstrate that you are passing on that relief to an affected tenant. So
in many scenarios, a tenant who's under financial pressure might also be negotiating with a landlord who's under similar pressure.
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of the code, the overarching principle is that the parties reach mutually beneficial arrangements. Everyone acknowledges that everyone's struggling and suffering during this period. The idea is that everybody comes out the back end of it with their leases in place and with, things going back to normal.
Sam, thanks so much for being with us today and for the benefit of all your advice.
Oh, thanks for your time, appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam. With rent being one of the highest fixed costs to business, I hope this discussion has helped you make some decisions about how to better survive amid the current lockdown. Thanks for joining us, and thanks again to our sponsor, Wollongong City Council. We'll see you next week.